thank you for joining me here at another episode of Foundation with Steve Teed. I am your host and servant, Steve Teed, asking you just one question. What are you building your life on? Are you building your life on a solid foundation, or are you building your life on one that is leaky, that is cracked, and when it really comes down to it, doesn't stand up? And so that's what we do here. We look at news stories, and we look at things like memes, and we may expand the program as we go, as things develop. It's just the way it goes. But for now, let me cut back on the theme music a little bit here. And now, as we are together, let me cover what we're going to do in today's episode. We're going to be doing our news you may be able to use as we look at some news stories from usually around the world, but today they're going to be all from Canada. And it's not such a bad thing, because in Canada, I'll let you know, Canada's usually behind the United States in a little bit. But when it comes to things like immorality, Canada seems to be ahead. See, many people say that Canada's biggest export, it would be like our natural resources. I would argue that Canada's biggest export is immorality. We really are. They're ahead of the curve on drug usage, on liberal theology, wokeism. Canada's ahead of it on all the curves. So we're going to be looking at some news in Canada, and as I said, if you're from the States, you may go, I don't know if I want to do this. It may not apply to me, but I guarantee you it will. Canada may be just ahead of the curve, but the United States, you're not too far behind. In fact, the way it usually seems to go is something happens in Europe, then it comes into Canada, and then it eventually makes its way down to the States. So we're going to look at two newscasts, news articles from there. One's about a new law that came into effect into Canada, and another one's just an article from the news organization Global TV. Then we're going to take a commercial break. Not really going to be a commercial, it'll be something a little different for you this time, but something to break it up a little bit, something that I'll say that I enjoy, but probably made for a little different reason than you. And then we're going to finish up with the segment, Why You So Meme. I said we'd get to it last episode, we didn't get a chance, but we will get to it this time. And so we'll be looking at, what do you meme? So let's get into the show. We got quite a bit of ground to cover today, and so we're going to get right into it with our newscast. So the first thing I got to do is I got to get on our news music here. So let me pull up our news musical. So recently, as I said, there's a new law passed in Canada. And in fact, you can see it kind of advertised a little bit on Justin Trudeau's Facebook page. Now, I'm well convinced that most political leaders don't really operate their own Twitter accounts and Facebook pages, but hey, that's just kind of the way it goes. But here's the post. Let me bring up the post here. So Justin Trudeau, blue check mark, all that, says this: as of today, it's official. Conversion therapy is banned in Canada. Our government's legislation has come into force, which means it is now illegal to promote, advertise, benefit from, or subject someone to this hateful and harmful practice anywhere in our country. To the survivors who bravely shared their stories, the advocates who kept pushing forward, and the parliamentarians who worked together to pass this important legislation, thank you. And to the LGBTQ2 Canadians, our government will always stand with you and will keep working hard to make you feel safe and welcome, no matter who you love or how you identify. So that is our first news story. That's kind of the introduction there. That was Justin Trudeau saying, congratulations, look, today we got this new law that comes into effect. Now I want to talk about that law in particular. And the reason being is because the way they passed it is something to talk about, because it's a pattern that has happened, I've noticed. So I'm going to talk about the method that they use to convince people of it, because it's on a bad foundation. I want to talk a little bit about the actual bill itself, and we'll go through the bill, because I have it here. I got it from the actual Commons House there. And I want to talk about, is the foundation secure, and what could that possibly mean? Because they make some accusations in there, in this bill, that you have to catch. So I want to go visit this bill first. Let's pull up the bill. Bill C-4, that's what it was called, Bill C-4. That is what he was referring to. There's anti-conversion therapy. So the first thing you need to do is kind of understand what is conversion therapy. But let me read the summary of the bill first, and then we'll get into what the bill defines as conversion therapy. The summary of it. This enactment amends the criminal code to, among other things, create the following offenses. So it's a criminal code. This is actually the criminal case now. Causing another person to undergo conversion therapy. Doing anything for the purpose of removing a child from Canada with the intention that the child undergo conversion therapy outside Canada. Promoting or advertising conversion therapy, and receiving a financial or other material benefits from the provision of conversion therapy. And it says it also amends the criminal code to authorize courts to order that advertisements for conversion therapy be disposed of or deleted. Now, I'm going to stop there. That was just a summary. The question I'm going to ask you right now is, what do you think of when you think of conversion therapy? Because that is an important question, because this is a tactic that is being used constantly to push laws, to pass laws, to do things like that. What do you think of when you think of conversion therapy? Well, odds are you're probably thinking of such things as tied in a room with a bulb above their head where they're tortured, this kind of thing, like electroshock therapy, and such along the lines of that. Or I believe there actually was a South Park episode one time. I didn't watch too much South Park when I was younger, but I remember this particular episode. I had friends who watched it, and I was there. And it's one where it's like, they kept going this whole thing where it's like, are you confused? I think it was Butters. I think that's his name. It's like, are you confused? And he's like, well, yeah, I'm confused. He was confused because he had no clue what they were talking about, and they sent him off to conversion camp kind of thing. And so they're talking about this idea of conversion therapy, but the question is that what this bill is talking about? Is this bill talking about those? I will agree that if that's what it was talking about, then yes, those are harmful practices that should be denounced. That's really what should happen. This should never happen to any person at all. And so if that's where it stood, that's where it would be. But is that the case? Well, I'm not so sure. I'm going to flip down the bill a little bit. I may go back and look at some others because in the middle of it, I just understand what this bill is. You can look it up for yourself. It's the removal of advertisements of things for conversion therapy, and the court gets to determine what that is and do you meet that kind of thing. It's just some amendments to it, and what they've connected conversion therapy to is, when you read the bill, are things such as child pornography, advertisement of sexual services, of that kind of thing, of intimate images of kids is really what they've connected it to. And then they added in the line, or an advertisement for conversion therapy. That's what they've done. So they equate the two things to that location. And again, if they were defining conversion therapy as taking somebody against their will, locking them in a room, that kind of idea, or like lobotomy, shock therapy, then absolutely. But is that the definition? Well, let's look at it, because they have to define it in the new law. So let's look at it. The definition of conversion therapy. So it says, conversion therapy means a practice, treatment, or service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, B, change a person's gender identity to cisgender, C, change a person's gender expression so that it conforms to the sex assigned to the person at birth, D, repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior, E, repress a person's non-cisgender gender identity, or F, repress or reduce a person's gender expression that does not conform to the sex assigned to the person at birth. And then it does give this statement. For greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to the exploration or development of an integrated personal identity, such as a practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's gender transition, and that is not based on an assumption that a particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression is to be preferred above another. Now, in everything I just read, where do you see that it is limited to the idea that, hey, this is just about taking someone against their will? It's not there. And this is the real danger of the law, is they've defined gender conversion, or sorry, not gender conversion, conversion therapy to anything that designs to help somebody who, whether they want it or not, to go from anything that's not heterosexual, or how they define as cisgender, and help them to come that way. And first of all, notice that they don't say anything about going the other way. They really don't. But let me... So conversion therapy, I'm going to continue just a little bit more because there's one more section. We'll come back and talk about this. Conversion therapy, everyone who knowingly causes another person to undergo conversion therapy, included by providing conversion therapy to that other person, is A, guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 5 years, or guilty of an offense punishable on summary conviction. So, you've got to understand what that actually could mean. That could mean if a child, a young child, is struggling with a sense of self, and if a child says, and this happens all the time, that, hey, a young boy says, hey, I'm a girl, and the parent says, well, no, you're not, you're a boy, and it's like, well, let's find someone to talk to, let's go talk to somebody, that parent would now be guilty of conversion therapy, of indictable offense, liable to imprisonment, term of not more than 5 years, who knowingly causes another person to undergo conversion therapy. And they've defined conversion therapy. That's the trick. How did they define it? If you repress or reduce a person's gender expression, repress a person's non-cisgender identity, repress or reduce non-sexual heterosexual attraction, change a person's gender expression so that it conforms to the gender birth. You see, the problem is the definition is so broad that, hey, this is wrong. So basically what has happened, the underlying thing here is twofold. One, that the way that you're born could be wrong, and if you hold that, hey, that sex and gender are equivalent, and they were up till about 5 years ago, they were always defined as the same, that if you try to say, hey, no, if your child says, hey, I'm a girl, if he's a boy, or girl says, hey, I'm a boy, and they say that, and you correct them, you could be guilty of conversion therapy. Or if you come out and say that, hey, that this is wrong, you could be guilty of conversion therapy. This is the problem. You say, well, it doesn't say that in the law. Well, it doesn't say it doesn't. That's the issue, is it's not narrowed enough. It's so open. Now, one of the things that is there, it's even the language of this is the idea that it's adding a validation to saying that, hey, if you claim to be that you're born male and you are male, that you're born female and there's female, and you say that there's only male or female, well, therefore, you're wrong. You're wrong about this. This is the government saying this. I'm putting this into law. And so to teach anything else about that, well, then you're absolutely wrong. Now, the other thing I really want you to notice that it's only talking about one way. And they're only acknowledging one way. They're arguing that the only type of conversion therapy that exists is taking somebody from non-heterosexual to heterosexual. They would never acknowledge that there is a conversion therapy of turning people who were naturally... I'll use their language, but I think it's a bunch of malarkey anyway, of cisgender, somebody who's naturally cisgender. That their definition of cisgender is somebody who they're biologically a sex, and they emotionally feel that sex. Now, there's a whole bunch of can of worms there, and therefore, what that is somebody who normally that way, they can be convinced to go the other way. And yet people want to say, no, you're born that way, you cannot change it. And I would say that's an absolute lie that you believe that. And I've even saw it, I'd have to go back and find the article from a psychologist who argues that we need to stop saying that you are born gay, that there is an inherent gay gene. Because the studies don't show this. Psychologically, they don't show this, and if that were true, then every set of identical twins where one came out gay, the other one would have to be gay as well. I don't care if that's male or female. When they're identical twins. I didn't say fraternal, identical. Why? Because they're genetically identical. That's kind of the issue. It doesn't work. And if this were true, you would not see in our current culture a sudden spike. And I mean spike. We're talking like 4 times the amount of kids and youth coming out as bisexual, transgender, and all this. Why is there such a thing happening? Because it's being pushed in children's books, it's being pushed in movies, it's being pushed in kids' cartoons, it's being pushed in Sesame Street, it's pushed everywhere. I remember even watching with my kids the Minions movie. Now, I admit, my kids love the Despicable Me movies. They like Gru, they like the Minions, that kind of thing. And we were watching the Minions movie, and it was the introduction. I believe the villainess's name is Scarlet Overkill. I think that's her name. And she comes out and she's doing like her monologue kind of thing, and you have to catch it. But she's singing her song, and it's this idea. It's kind of this idea, if you want, of wokeism a little bit, where it's like a female empowerment. That's, you can argue that one way or the other. I'm not concerned about that at that point. But she makes a point in the statement to say, well, the times are a-changin'. And as soon as she says that, it shows a gentleman in the row, and he's clearly a guy. Got the beard, everything. And how is he dressed? He's dressed exactly like she is. Wig, dress, the whole bit. This is conditioning of our kids. And you may look and say, I don't even see it. I get some friends, one of their movies that they actually like, Steven Seagal movies, old movies, not his new ones. I think it's called Fire Down Below. It's actually a pretty good movie. But they call it Things Blow Up, because it is a movie where a lot of things blow up. But he's walking with the lead female character. He's a EPA agent, I think, is what he is. And he's walking with them, and they look over to where the mines are, and they just see, like, pollution everywhere. And he asks her the question. He's like, doesn't that worry people around here? And her response is, if you live with something long enough, you just kind of get used to it. And I think that is what is happening in our culture, is that it's not that our kids, there's suddenly this new generation who are being born with homosexual tendencies and transgenderism. It's the fact that they're so exposed to it. It's all around them and being pushed that, hey, this is the way it's going to be. That's conversion therapy. That is brainwashing of our younger generations. Yet this law speaks nothing of it. If you try to stop it, it says that's conversion therapy. And to speak out against it could put you against the law. That's the problem with it. And so it's this idea that saying that everything is right. Well, if everything is right, then nothing is wrong. And so then I would limit this to it, and I understand this. If gender is a construct, sexuality is a social construct, then, and humanity is nothing but animals, then why is it that they still have a problem with, I'll use their definition, because it came out too, of their problem of MAPS, minor attracted persons. They're arguing that, hey, it's just a gender expression, it's a sexuality, just the same it is. Again, why, not just that one, why is incest considered illegal? Every argument you make for for every argument you make for homosexuality and why it should be valid, it can be made of incest. It really could. Why? Well, just think about it. Two consenting adults. Who are you to tell them who to love? Who are you to tell them who to love? And people say, well, it could hurt the genetic code if a brother and sister marry and have children. Well, sure, then why not make sure that they can't have children? Get the guy snipped, get the guy a vasectomy, get her a hysterectomy, whatever, and say, hey, they can't have kids. So if they can't have kids, and leave them be, why are you saying that's wrong? And you go, well, that's repulsive. Well, see, there's the problem. Now, I could spend a lot more time talking about gender theory, and I can talk about all this, and there's a lot of issues with it. I may, in the future, if somebody really is that interested, I'll go a lot more in depth to it, because there's a lot wrong with it. But there's another spot here on this foundation that I want to get to that they say that is very more damaging. And I want you to see it here, and it has to do with the preamble in this cast. The preamble here. Look at what the preamble says. It says, whereas conversion therapy causes harm to the person who is subject to it, whereas conversion therapy causes harm to society because, among other things, it is based on and propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, including the myth that heterosexuality, cisgender, gender identity, and gender expression that conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. Now, I'm going to stop there. Did you catch this? This is whereas conversion therapy causes harm to society because, among other things, here it is, it's based on and propagates myths and stereotypes of sexual orientation. Now, I'm going to come at this from two ways. I really am. I'm going to come at this from an argument, from a worldview, a foundation of evolution, and I'm going to come at it at the other foundation, which I think is much more secure. And if you look at it, both of those foundations, which disagree with each other, but they agree on this matter, that homosexuality serves no real purpose. Now, in the theory of evolution, you can argue that people, if you're going to argue that people are born with homosexual tendencies and homosexuality, it has to have a purpose. Everything in evolution has a purpose. It's particularly when it comes. So the ultimate goal of evolution, which in the end is, I'm not going to say irrelevant, but it's futile, because in the end of theory of evolution, everything's going to cease to exist no matter how you look at it. But in the theory of evolution, the goal is to pass on the genetic code to the next generation so you continue to develop and develop well. So therefore, you could argue that somebody who gives into homosexuality and sexual tendencies and lives that lifestyle, that this would be evolution's way of saying they should never reproduce. That there's something genetically wrong with them that we don't know what it is, but there's something wrong that evolution says they should not reproduce. That would be the only logical conclusion. And I believe Richard Dawkins even picks this up. Leading atheist picks that up. And so you got this idea that, hey, wait a minute. No, in the theory of evolution, cisgender and heterosexuality is needed, because without it, the human race would die off. So no matter how you look at it, from the theory of evolution, it's not saying that there's no moral grounds for it, so it's not saying it's wrong, but evolution would say it's preferred to pass on the genetic code. Now, there's that aspect to it, but I'm not going to spend too much of that. I want the other side, where it says that it's based and propagates myths and stereotypes. What myths are they talking about? What myths are they returning? What stereotypes are they talking about here? And they specifically mention on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. It says, and the myth, this including the myth, notice the myth, keep that word, that heterosexuality, cisgender identity, and gender expression that conforms to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. The myth. What myth are they talking about? They're talking about the Christian worldview. They're talking about the foundation that originally this country was built upon, and the foundation that the United States was built upon. They're saying that that the scriptures, this is the government of Canada writing into law, that anything that states that humanity was created male and female is nothing but a myth. That's what it comes down to. That's what they're saying, that it's a myth. This is the problem here. I said there's many things happening in this law here. First, it defines conversion therapy as anything that helps to prevent or lessen, even lessen, same-sex attraction, or whatever other attraction they want to come up with. Because in this grand scheme of things with gender theory, you don't just have male and female anymore. You got, well, whatever you feel. So there's about 7.2 billion people. I'm probably wrong on that number. Therefore, there'd be 7.2 billion genders that you have to acknowledge. And I've seen some pretty strange ones on TikTok and things like that. And and they're saying it's all valid because it's a foundation. There's nothing valid, and say, well, yet the Bible is wrong. Any ideology that teaches that you're born male and female, anything that says that it's designed this way, well, that's wrong. Well, here comes the issue. What happens to churches who still proclaim that Jesus Christ is the only way, who proclaim that humanity was made in the image of God, that male and female, he created them, in the image of God created he them. They were created male and female. Male was created, and female was made it to complement and, in essence, to complete male. And it's the two together that have the image of God, that are blessed by God. Not to mention, as you look at the studies, the breakdown of the home, the removal of the father figure from the home. I think is probably one of the leading causes of many of the issues that we have in our society today. It almost comes down to, you want to know why in the home that there's such an increase of homosexuality and transgenderism? I think there's a direct correlation to an absentee father, be it an emotional absentee or a physical absentee father, that this leads to the growth of problems within the home. It leads to the growth of discipline problems. It leads to a problem of anxiety, of worry, of depression amongst our young people. Why? Because you've taken it away from God's way and said anything goes. That's really what it comes down to. And I don't think it's any secret that the leading number of proposed transgenders in our society today are teenage girls. Why? Because typically teenage girls, believe it or not, they definitely need their father just as much as young men do. They're seeking for acceptance. They're seeking to belong, especially during those teenage years. And they're do whatever they can. And all of a sudden, they've got this statement that they can come out and say, hey, look, I'm this. And people are going to cheer. People are going to say, yeah. They're basically going to do what a cult does and love bomb them into that way of life. This is the danger why there's also a trend, a huge uptick in autistic children coming out as transgender and things. And I will tell you, as a father of autistic children, all of my children, in one way or another, are on the spectrum, that I can tell you that when helping them develop, particularly my year or two, helping them develop, it comes down to affection and you showing them love, and you can affirm them, looking for affirmation to help them learn how they should grow. And this is what is happening to our young people. And yet the government comes out and says, hey, the Bible is a myth. This is government legislation. The Bible's a myth. Despite the fact that I can show you philosophically, I can show you scientifically, I can show you archaeologically, and I can show you morally why the scriptures are correct. Why doing it God's way will absolutely lead to the better way. Yet our government says, hey, you try to correct any of these things, then you're automatically, you can be a criminal under our code. The sad definition is anybody who hears this podcast could technically go to the government of Canada once it passed. Now, it's not completely into law yet, because the very bottom of the article comes out and says how long it will be before it comes in. I think it's like 30 days after royal assent. This act comes into force on the 30th day after the day on which it receives royal assent. So it may not actually be enacted yet, because that original post there from Justin Trudeau, it kind of says it was like the 7th of January. So it got a little bit of time. Could look at this and say, hey, he's promoting conversion therapy. Why? Because he's arguing that there is one way, that there is a way that we should be. That's kind of the way it is. And so this is what's happening in our country. This is what's happening in our culture. And as I said, you may be in the States, but hey, this is coming to you too. Canada's ahead on the curve on this, and it's a bad thing to be ahead on. This does not make me proud to be Canadian. It really doesn't at all. But it underlies everything. At a foundation that has removed the gospel of Jesus Christ, and a nation that removes itself from the foundation of the scriptures, the foundation of the Christian ethics, the foundation of the Creator, is not a nation that will survive for very long. And I firmly believe that what has happened in our youth, that what has happened in our culture, and what you see why there are such issues, is because they've removed themselves from the foundation. Because when you remove a firm foundation, you replace it with one that says basically anything goes. And this is what you see. And I tell you, this is also from experience. I work with a lot of the youth here. And before COVID all hit and all that, we had close to 25, 30 youth coming on a weekly basis. And we talked about things like gender expression. We talked about things such as transgenderism and issues from the scientific point of view, from the psychological point of view. But yet one thing I noticed is that when it came down to it, most of the teen girls were having, I'll say, issues. Now that's pretty standard for teen girls. But I wasn't experiencing the same issue with most of the boys. And then when I looked at, okay, what was the difference? Not just male and female, because, hey, according to the culture, there is no difference anymore. Male and female, that's an interesting concept too when you talk about identity politics. But what really came down to is of most of the boys, we had about 12, 13 boys, they all came from two-parent homes, where the father was very active, the mother was very active in the home, and they were together. Yet the females, most of them, were coming from broken homes. I think that's a direct statement. That it's better for a mother and father This is what is needed. The heterosexual couple, the way that God designed it, is best. Having a foundation where it's on the scriptures and it's on Christ is the only solid foundation. Now, I'm going to take a break for now. It's a bit heavy here. I'll come back with the maybe the other news story and then our final segment. I really want to get to the meme. If we have in our Why You So Meme segment. But I'm gonna go off to a commercial break just a little bit. I hope you enjoy it as well. So let's go to commercial break. We'll come back in a few minutes just to unwind from that heavy topic. I'll see you back here in a couple of minutes as you can join us in. So enjoy this one, not a commercial break so much, a musical interlude. That's what it's gonna be. Enjoy.
All to Jesus I surrender, all to Him I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him in His presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender all. And all to Thee, my blessed Savior, I surrender all to Jesus I surrender. Make me Savior wholly Thine. Let me feel Thy Holy Spirit. Truly know that Thou art mine. I surrender all. I surrender all. And all to Thee, my blessed Savior, I surrender all. And all to Jesus I surrender, Lord. I give myself to Thee. Fill me with Thy love and power, and let Thy blessing fall on me. And I surrender all. I said I surrender all. And all to Thee, my blessed Savior, I surrender all. I said all to Thee, my blessed Savior, I surrender all.
All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that rendition of I Surrender All. I gotta tell you, I'm a little bit biased there because that was my beautiful wife. One of the greatest gifts that God has given me. My beautiful wife. My kids are another one, but obviously they all pale in comparison to the greatest gift that He has given me, the gift of salvation. And I got to, I'm using things like that because, well, we're not here on a big budget, and so we work within the copyright laws here. There's no reason to go against the laws of man as long as they're not against the laws of God. And so, as I said, we're going to be back coming the other news story here. I want to cover the second news story that we're going to get into. And so here's our second news story for that. We need our other news opening thing here. Kind of our news thing. Well, here we go. News opening. Oh yeah, our second news article that I want to cover in today's episode says this. It's called Gone by 2040. Why some religions are declining in Canada faster than ever. That's a good question. One of the things that they said they noticed through COVID is that it's been declining. But I want to take a deeper look at this because when they use religions, they're using it in kind of a funny way. And I don't mean funny, haha, I mean funny as in odd. Because it shows that they don't understand what is actually going on. Now, this is an article I have read, obviously, beforehand. That's kind of the way it goes. But I want to pull in here a little bit. Because when it talks about religion, it's not really talking about religion per se. Let me pull it up here a little bit. As I said, let's look at this a little bit. It says, it's Advent Sunday and snow is falling thick and fast outside the front doors of the soaring neo-Gothic bell tower of the Metropolitan United Church in downtown Toronto. A tiny crowd huddles around a black Weber grill, emitting brief puffs of smoke as a crackling fire battles the elements. Come, gather around the holy barbecue, Reverend Jason Myers jokes. It's a modern scene amid very modern challenges facing religious institutions in Canada. Then it's this. Religiosity in Canada is at an all-time low, with recently released data from Statistics Canada showing only 68% of Canadians 15 or older now report having religious affiliations. It is the first time that number has dipped below 70% since StatCan began tracking the data in 1985. And then it says this. It is important to note that this decline is not across the board. The number of Muslims, Sheiks, Buddhists, and Hindus is increasing, and StatCan predicts the number of Canadians reporting a non-Canadian religious affiliation could be doubled by the year 2036. Now, I want to talk about just that just for a second. I want you to notice something. There's the way the language is used. That's what you have to understand. That's what you got to look at. The way that language is used is very important because I said what we want to look at is the foundation behind it. Now, they make the statement that the youth who have a religious affiliation is dropped. Now, there's plenty of reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but there are some things here I want to point out. But notice when it talks about Muslims, Sheiks, and Buddhists and Hindus. This is increased in Canadian. And so number of Canadians reporting a non-Christian religious affiliation could be doubled. Now, they do argue later on in the article about why that is. Why is it that they have doubled? Well, there's a very good reason for that. It's immigration. It's immigration. It's because of what's happened in Syria. It's because of what's happened in various places. They've immigrated to Canada as refugees. So it really shot. I know in our city here, a mosque was built, and they're in the process of building a bigger mosque. Why? This isn't birth rates. This is immigration. It's really what it is. But there is a question of why is it declining so much? Why is it? Now, I want to notice some things here. Again, remember I said they're defining religion. I want to go back to this article, and let's look, okay? Christianity, however, is in sharp decline. In 2011, 67.3%, about 22.1 million people of Canadians said that they were affiliated with a Christian religion. In 2019, that number had dropped to 63.2%. Catholicism, Canada's largest denomination, now accounts for 32% of Canadians over 15, down from 46.9%. Then it says the decline is even more precarious for the Canada's United and Anglican churches. In the 2021, the first Sunday in Advent, the season that commemorates Christmas or the birth of Jesus Christ, has fallen on Toronto's first snow day, November 28th. Just 6 people have come to congregate around the Weber Grill for Metropolitan Tattle Creek Wild Church. Sorry, I'll never understand why churches have these really long names. Truthfully, that's probably based off the location, but Tattle Creek's Wild Church, there's a name for you. A more modern and nature-based service than traditional Sunday service. And that's a key thing, I think, there. Then it says, being experimental, it tends to track smaller numbers than the standard Sunday service held an hour earlier. but that one too had barely 50 people in attendance, 2 to 3 people per pew scattered across the carnivorous church. And then it's talking to the United Church, but membership in the United Church of Canada has been decreasing for decades, far beyond a snowstorm of a global pandemic. Then it says we lose a church per week. The UCC is the country's second largest Canadian Christian denomination. Now notice this. It's accounted for 14.6% of Canadian churches, Canadian Christians, in 1985. In 1996, that number declined to 9.7% and to just 3.8% in 2019. Then it says Islam, considered a minority religion, sits just below that at 3.7%. And it says nowadays, Myers says, on average, the United Church loses one church per week across Canada. And his argument is he acknowledges that many people brought up in religious lose interest, but then they come back after their 30s, kind of like how he did. Now, that's a pretty sharp decline if you look at that. From 1985, 14.6% of Canadian Christians were classified as united. And by the year 2019, just 3 years ago now, we're 2022, I guess, it's down to 3.8%. What attributed to that fall? What really attributed to? Now, the United Church is declined that much. And then it covers the Anglican Church right then as well. That they have fallen so far. And how much they've lost. And then they ask the question a little bit later that Anglicanism gone by 2040. They were at, again, their numbers are 10.4% in 86, and that dropped to 7% in 96, and then 3.8% in 2019. So they're suffering greatly. But the question is, what really is happening here? What is happening? Why is this decline? Is it really because of the fact that the youth are just no longer interested? Well, you can make a partial argument for that, and I'm not going to cover why I believe that is so, but I think it really has to do with discipleship, and it has to do with the parents, that kind of thing. But it has nothing to do with really not being interested. I think it has to do with something more. And here it is. I'm going to pull it up a little bit more, a little further down the article. It says the idea of modernity, which is based on science. That's partly true. Modernity is actually the idea that it is almost science-based, but it's the idea that if you can't experience it, taste, touch, feel, your senses, then it doesn't exist. So it can't really be modernity is the issue, because we're now living in a postmodern world where it's no longer really even about science. But it's about how I feel. And many people believe in angels, they believe in spirits, they believe in New Age teachings, they believe in the Force, whatever. So it's not really has anything to do with modernity. But let me continue on here. It says is somehow intrinsically against religion. There's a view that it is out there, not one that I agree with, that science and religion can't mix, he says. Eliot says that the Anglican Church must adapt to survive. And I think that's the key problem right there, that they must adapt to survive. So what are they adapting to? I think of it very much like climate change. He says the people resonate to climate change. He says the three main responses to climate change. There's denial, then there's people who say we can stop it, then there's people who say we can adapt. And he says that's what I'm trying to get us to do with the Anglican Church. It's how do we adapt to it. Now, that there, I think, is the main key of why these happen. Now, notice it says religions. It's what it says, religions. But that's not actually true. Because later on in the article, let me show you here. One more clip and then I'll come back to this. However, some denominations were well above this average. It says growing, that they were growing, not declining. Why? It says mostly more evangelical groups. And then it wants to go off to Jehovah's Witnesses, and there's a problem there because that will show you that they automatically equivocate Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons as Christian, despite the fact that their actual doctrines are very different and they're not actually Christian. But why is it, the question then, that the United Church and the Anglican Church are so declining, where typically evangelical churches are on the rise? Does it have to do with the issue that the United and Anglican churches are very liturgical? Not really. That's not the issue. I think it has to do with exactly what he said. And I think that's where the key is, where he says that the Anglican Church has to adapt to it. So he says, three main responses: denial, that it doesn't exist, that we can stop it, or we can adapt to it. So what he's basically saying is the church, like, we're just going to ignore that this is happening in the decline, or that we can stop the decline, he's basically saying, or we need to change it. I think that's why they've actually lost. I don't think it's any secret, if you really look at why is it that the United Church and the Anglican Church have declined so much. And why is it that on average, the evangelical church hasn't? It has to do with their foundation. It really does. You see, the United Church of Canada, now if you're in the States and you're listening, you maybe wonder, well, what's the United Church of Canada? Think of it very similar to your Methodist church. The United Church of Canada split off from the Methodists, but they're very similar in a lot of doctrines. The United Church is very, very liberal. They really are. They're most like extreme liberal. The idea, they do preach, for the most part, they preach about God. They talk about God. They have scripture in their services. You can pull up a United Church, that most times they have everything written out. You can see what they do. But it's in their foundation. The United Church of Canada, and it's been a while since I've looked at their website, but I looked at their actual statements, but they do not hold to certain tenets anymore. They do not hold that Jesus Christ is the only way. They will say, well, Jesus is right for us. But who's to say, and their wording was, who to say that the Spirit of God is limited to a church and not active in a Sikh temple or a Buddhist temple or a Jewish synagogue? Well, who says that? Well, God did. I'm not saying God's not going to enter those and convict people, but what they're saying is that, hey, salvation is found in there. Well, who says it's not? Well, Jesus did. Jesus said that he's the way, the truth, and the life. That's who said it. So they got away from that. And what did they also do? They started to, for the world, say, we want to show love. Great, show love. But your definition of love is wrong. Their definition of love is just accept everybody, accept everything, make everybody feel welcome. I'm sorry, but the gospel of Jesus Christ isn't necessarily going to make everybody feel warm and fuzzy. And in fact, you can see this in the scriptures where Peter is preaching. Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches. And at the end of it, the people say, and it says they were cut to the heart. That means it convicted them at the very heart. And in that situation, they said, what must we do? But then you turn over to Acts chapter 7, which records Stephen before the Sanhedrin, and he preaches the gospel. Exact same message, a little different, but same message. And it says they were cut to the heart, and instead of they accepting it, they turned and they covered their ears and took him out and killed him. That's what happened. I'm sorry, the most loving thing we can do is not tell people that they're fine in their sin. It's not saying everybody's okay, everyone's going to get to heaven. The most loving thing we can do is proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we are in need of forgiveness. That's what it is. And you see, that's what has to happen. And I firmly believe that the reason the Anglican Church and the United Church have declined so much is because they've built their foundation on what's called the social gospel, to alleviate social ills, to reach out to how they classified the oppressed, how they classified those who are the marginalized. And the definition of those things has changed over the last 20, 40 years. It really has. You see, I'm all for feeding the hungry. I'm all for looking after the orphans, the widows, reaching out to the homeless. But when your mission statement has more to do with just making sure that transgender prostitutes have showers and sending them on their way and saying they're fine, you've got a problem. The reason the church meets these physical needs is so that we can introduce them to the one who meets their spiritual needs. And on average, the typical evangelical church still proclaims Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This is what is growing. Where the churches that have gone into the liberal aspect and have taken away the foundation and have circumvented themselves to the social gospel, they don't have a foundation to stand on. Because typically what has happened in that same article, we'll cover it later down. I don't have time today to cover this because I want to get to our last segment. But what that argument even points out is because they went to more of a social aspect, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, which are good things. But when the government steps in and provides these social structures as well, then the people ask the question, what do I need the church for? And this is what you see the people asking in society today. I don't need the church to be a good person. And I will say you're absolutely correct. Being a good person has nothing to do with attending church. It has nothing to do with how many times you go to church. Now, I can argue, how do you know that you're good? But that's a different issue. See, the church is not, their primary mission is not to go out and to show people how to be a good person and to alleviate social woes. The mission of the church is to go forth and proclaim Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This is why the Apostle Paul stated, I am resolved to know nothing but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And in living out our faith in Christ provides good works. But again, our ultimate goal is to do these good works, and therefore using those good works, alleviating the hungry, helping the homeless, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, the impoverished, for the purpose of bringing and introducing them to Jesus Christ. That is what we see. See, the mistake is the fact that saying we have to build the church of God. No, the scriptures have made it abundantly clear. When the church seeks to honor Jesus Christ, that is through every aspect, and it will be shown in the way it treats people outside, it treats them aligned, as it treats those who are on the outcast. It will be shown in that, because the love of God will permeate through them, that Jesus Himself will build His church. And the church that builds itself on Christ, and when Jesus builds the church, He made it abundantly clear that the gates of hell will not prevail. And when a church moves off of that foundation, the church will crumble. And this is what you see on average, I believe, in the United Church of Canada and on the Anglican Church. And as I said, this may look like a Canadian problem, but it is not. It is throughout North America, through evangelical Christianity, as they move away from the gospel of Jesus Christ to things like critical race theory, to move on to gender theory and identity hermeneutics. They get off of that foundation, the church will continue to decline. But a church that is built on Jesus will never pass, because the gates of hell will not prevail. All right, I want to move on to our last segment here. I want to move on to Why Are You So Meme? Let's go over to, hit my meme music here. Pull that up here. There we go. Our meme music saying, why are you so meme? Where we take a look at a meme and look at what's behind it, and is it correct? So today, our meme's going to come from kind of an atheistic form, and I'm going to pull it up for you. For our visual audience, you'll be able to see it. For the listening audience, I'm going to have to describe it for you. So our meme today, it's kind of taken, I'm guessing, from Revelation chapter 4, the Church of Laodicea. And the actual verse is, behold, I stand at the door and knock. He who hears my voice and opens the door, I will enter in, and I will eat with him, and he with me. So that's kind of the image. That's the picture it's using, the artistic rendition. And if you're looking at that, yes, I know that's not what Jesus looked like. Jesus did not look like a European white man at all. But this is a picture of the meme. But here's what it says. It starts with Jesus saying, let me in. The guy on the inside saying, why? Jesus saying, so I can save you. The person says, from what? And then you have Jesus saying, from what I'm going to do to you if you don't let me in. So that's kind of the meme here. So I want to talk about that just for a little bit, because it's got an underlying assumption here. It's like Jesus seeking to come in, Jesus seeking to have a relationship with him. That's great. The person saying why, that's a great question. And this is one that churches need to answer as we continue to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why do I need it? But here's where it goes AWOL. Because it's Jesus saying, I can save you, but they're saying from what? Because it's saying, if you don't, I'm going to do something to you. And this is a misunderstanding of the judgment of God. You see, this understanding, and this is the underlying assumption, that God created laws, that God has a holy law, that all he wants to do is that he's so wicked, he's so mean, that he's going to judge us, and so God's going to save us from himself. That God created this system that he's going to, just wants to come after us. I guess is kind of the idea here, that we only need to be saved from God. So therefore, they're saying Christianity doesn't make any sense. There's kind of the issue here. But there's some things here that I would ask questions on this. First of all, if God wanted to wipe us out, why is that a bad thing? Interesting question. Huh? You got to remember, from an atheistic worldview, there's no ultimate standard of right and wrong. There really isn't. That's kind of the problem here. You can try to come up with some philosophies of why there's right, why there's wrong, but in actuality, they're gonna fall short. For there to be an absolute moral standard that's applicable to all things, it has to come from one who's above it, one who sets it up. That kind of issue. That's one of the issues that is there. So why would it be wrong for God to wipe us out? So you get that issue. But it's the misunderstanding that's saying that God is saving us from himself. Well, he's not really. You see, even in our own culture, we know that there's a right and a wrong in some aspect. For example, child molestation is wrong. Rape is wrong. We just looked at an article earlier in this podcast about this idea, how the government's talked about, hey, saying conversion therapy is wrong. And people say, yeah, that's wrong. So we say that's wrong. And therefore, when somebody commits a crime, a punishment is needed if they're found guilty. And again, so what's the absolute standard? Well, if God is holy and God is just, which this meme is basically saying, yes, God exists, it has to make that assumption that God is there and that God is going to pour out his wrath. The real question is, why is God going to pour out his wrath? Their argument is that God's just mean. That's really what it comes down to. That God's just mean. God just wants to do it. Therefore, believe in him, or he's going to punish you, he's going to destroy you based on his own being. But that's not it at all. It's this assumption that humanity is good, that humanity is great. Again, there's nothing to base that assumption on if you don't have a moral standard. But that's not what we're going to be rescued from. You see, the Bible makes it clear, and we understand this, that if we do something wrong, if we break the law, we deserve the punishment, the full weight of the law upon us. Somebody who commits murder, it doesn't matter how many good deeds that they've made. It doesn't matter if they're a person who has saved hundreds of people. If they come home one day, and I've used this example with youth who seem to understand this pretty well, that if a person who's a doctor or paramedic, if they've saved hundreds of people in their line of work, and they come home and they catch their significant other in the midst of an affair, a sexual affair in bed, and they go into a blind rage and they murder their wife, their spouse, their significant other in cold blood, and the other person in cold blood, I ask the question, do they deserve to go to jail? And they say yes. And I ask, well, what about all those people they saved? They said, well, it doesn't matter. They still did this. And they're right. See, and this is the same true. If we've committed a crime, it doesn't matter what the crime is, we are a lawbreaker. And we deserve the punishment of the crime. It doesn't even matter if we agree with the law or not. It's just the way it is. We're a lawbreaker. And so we deserve the punishment of the law. Now all we can do at that point is we can beg for mercy. And therefore we hope that the judge will have mercy on us. That's ultimately what it comes down to. That's in a human court. And this is true as well when it comes to the divine law. God is holy. And God cannot put up with sin. And so God told us. He didn't just leave us at our own understanding, trying to figure out what's the moral law. He gave us the moral law. And isn't it fascinating that even people who say, well, you got the Ten Commandments, that's a copy of Hammurabi's law. Well, it'd be similar because there is what we call we were made in the image of God, the imago Deo, the divine image within us that includes a innate moral code that we all have. And this is why it's similar across the world, because we're made in the image of God. And so you would expect that a law that was put down by like Hammurabi would also look very similar to the Ten Commandments because it comes from God, ultimately. This is what the divine law is. And we've broken the divine law. And God has told us ahead of time, well, here's the punishment for the divine law. And God, who is graceful and merciful, it says he's chosen for a time to overlook it. But that doesn't mean it's going to never come. He's chosen to overlook the law that we've broken, the sin that we've broken. Why? So that he can offer us forgiveness. And he's told us ahead of time, you've broken my law. Here's the punishment. Well, what's the punishment? Well, Isaiah tells us that our iniquities have separated us from God. Our sin has separated us from God. We've lost the connection with our God, with our Creator, which many people are actually seeking for. This is why they turn to New Age mysticism, to connect with nature. They know that there's something out there they want to connect with because we've lost it. But ultimately what has happened, that the wages of sin, the consequence of sin is death. This isn't God saving us from him. This is God saving us not just from ourselves, but the consequence of that law. You see, so the same argument would be the government saying, hey, accept my laws. And you say, well, why? So I can save you. Well, from what? From the punishment of the laws that I've put into effect. And you say, well, that's not really true. But this is the same argument that is being used in this meme. And so the argument there is, again, it doesn't make sense. But the problem is the assumption that God just put laws in so he could punish us, so he could save us and make himself look good. That's not what it is at all. You see, when God created humanity, he desired a relationship with you and I. That's what he desired. And in that relationship with you and I, we broke it from our sin, with our willful disobedience of God. Every one of us has sinned. And God gave us free will. Why? Ultimately, so we could choose a relationship with him, so we could have a genuine relationship with him. But we broke it, and unfortunately, we could not rescue ourselves. Because we broke the law, we are deserving of the full punishment of the law. And God is going to punish those who've broken the law. Yet, he is merciful. And so just like before a human judge, all we can do is plead for mercy. We can do this with God and say, God, I am a sinner. I have broken your law. I understand. This is called confession. And then we say, have mercy. And God says, I will have mercy. God says, I will have mercy. And I will grant it to you. And he said, the price is paid through Christ. And so it's not Jesus saying, I'm going to save you from myself. It is Jesus saying, hey, I'm knocking on the door telling you, you're under wrath. The punishment is going to come, and you deserve it because you've broken the law. And the wrath of God is coming. But I want you to know that if you come to me for mercy, if you come to me with a penitent and repentant heart, it's like I'm coming to you to tell you this, you don't have to go through the wrath. You can be forgiven. And you can have the relationship that ultimately you desire with me. This is what Jesus is saying. See, that's the beauty of the gospel message. It shows us that, yes, we have broken God's law and we cannot get out from under it on our own power. Yet Jesus loved us so much that God demonstrated his love for us in this, that while we were yet sinners, he died for us. And he draws us to himself. This is why he's at the door. Not to save us from him, but to save us from the wrath that we rightfully deserve. And I urge you that if you're in that, to consider that and to look at that again. And so don't be looking at this and act it and say, hey, look how pompous and pious I am saying that, but saying, hey, I'm beginning to understand. That's the proper foundation. And so, again, I just want to come. I want to thank you for joining us, joining me here for our time foundation. And I encourage you again to build your life on a solid foundation. And truthfully, the foundation that is solid is that of Jesus Christ. Because the world's answers, the foundation of the world is on, the worldview of the world, doesn't really work. But the foundation of Jesus Christ is true to other. So this is your host and servant, Steve Teed, saying again, thanks for joining me, and urge you build your life on the foundation of Jesus Christ.